Hello, my name is Stuart Kimball, and tonight I'll be presenting ankle bracelet and military parachutist for my fall 2021 lightning strike. So a little bit of background as to what is parachuting and kind of what is the purpose of it within the military. Parachuting is the act of falling from a vehicle in the sky and utilizing the canopy to glide into a land position. The military utilizes this to insert troops from varying sizes or groups, whether it be a squad of about 7 or a battalion to about 100 or so individuals, into a hard to access geographical location, or they need to insert troops in an undetected sense, and an air to land approach is the most appropriate. So maybe there's not a road, or it's an island, or there's a security line and they're trying to land inside of the security line, and parachuting is the best approach. With that, there's two main types of parachuting, that being static line. The middle photo and right photo represent the static line. And then there's also free fall, which will be dictated or indicated on the photos on the left, stacked on top of each other. First, we'll get into static line. Static line is the act of troops, typically of the larger size, a battalion or more size, which will be all stacked up into a plane. They have that yellow cord going from their parachute to a cable inside the plane, that when they exit the vehicle, that yellow cord becomes taut, and that cord is being a static cord. When it is taut, it pulls onto the parachute, and the parachute opens from the back approximately 6 seconds after the troop exits the plane. Something to note, it's that circular canopy. These are not steerable for the most part. There's some tips and tricks that you can yank on one side and that tilts the whole parachute to that side. But for the most part, they're not maneuverable, with the exception of what the plane tries to land and place you. Also very common with inserting vehicles such as tanks or Humvees or those military Jeeps, because they are able to just be dropped out of a plane and landed in the approximate region. Not to go with maneuverability. If we're worried about maneuverability, we get into the free fall, which is the act of a plane going from that very high altitude, typically in which they are required to use the oxygen mask that you see onto the left side, which the military member jumps out of the plane. They look at their altimeter, typically worn on their wrist, to tell their altitude. When they get to that desired altitude, they pull their parachute. And then they have those rectangular parachutes, which have the capability for them to be steered and land where appropriate. There's two forms of free fall. There's going to be hey-ho and hey-low. Hey-ho being high altitude, high opening. And that's typically used if you're worried about the audible detection of a low opening, because there's a big whoosh or a snap when the parachute's opened. And then hey-low being high altitude, low opening is if you're more worried about visual detection, and you open your parachute a little bit lower to coast into the desired target landing area. Now we get into injuries associated. To note right off the bat, there's the lower extremity accounts for about 50% of all parachute injuries. Typically, that of the injuries are located in the ankle, which accounts for 30 to 60% of all lower extremity or all injuries in parachuters together. The typical injuries include ankle sprains, which account for 43.7%, and then ankle fractures, which accounts for 35.5% of all injuries. Fort Benning, Georgia, is where the Military Airborne School, which is that of which they learn how to do that static line jumping for all branches of the military for the most part. 29% of all injuries sustained at Fort Benning were of an ankle injury, being sprains and fractures with the majority. Out of 1,000 jumps, it's expected to sustain 1 to 4.5 injuries per that 1,000 jump. Fairly alarming rate, seeing as we're going to get into here in a second, explaining the airborne school. Airborne school is comprised of 3 phases. Phase 1 being ground school. That's where you learn the specifics about the pack. That's where you learn how to do the knees and ankles together, or you might hear it commonly as knees and feet together. And that's where they just learn the basics before they go up. And the second week is tower week, which they jump off these 35-foot towers as pictured in the slide. And they go on the cables, they land onto the ground, and that's where they practice the knees and feet together or the parachute landing. And they also have a pretty interesting or funny contraption, which they hang and an instructor pulls a rip cord, and that rip cord drops them approximately 5 feet, and they are to perform that parachute landing and they're not aware of when that landing is going to be, because with the static line, you should not be looking at the ground, whereas at free fall, you might actually be looking at the ground to anticipate the target landing time. So something to note is that they first introduced these parachute ankle braces pictured on the right in 1993 is when they started to look into them. 1994 is when they did a study. 1995 is when they implemented as to all students were required to wear them at Fort Benning during airborne school. And then you get into some concerns with the military as common. They were concerned about the cost of these parachute ankle braces, or the PABs. These PABs, there was also some rumors or some conversation that they cause further injuries of other areas. So while it did prevent ankle injuries, it didn't, it kind of contribute to other injuries. And then 2005, they were reintroduced after some studies were done in the half decade, and they identified that they should be utilized. They also cut the cost. They were more cost efficient to pay for PABs than it was to pay for the medical bills for the soldiers that were injured. And then in 2006, the military again cut them due to cost concerns as well as concerns related to other injuries. From 2006 to now, they have identified that they are cost efficient and that they do not lead to injuries in other areas. So it begs the question as to why have they not been brought back? Mostly because the stipulations and the skepticism around the items, primarily that with the cost as well. So kind of get into the so what factor. You might have noted that on the last slide, the picture of the PAB was black and white. Black and white because they really haven't changed since 1993 when they were first designed and idea to put in. The boot you also might have noted in that last slide is that they were the old black combat boot typically worn in Vietnam, and they had a very large heel cup and a very large heel step, which that bottom ankle strap would cut in between so that it would prevent it from sliding off. Whereas nowadays, the boots on the right are the Nikes. The Nikes are one of the most common worn combat boot post-purchase, or the soldier purchases on their own, mostly due to comfort, which is very similar style cut and boot to all the other boots in the military. But you'll note that there is not that heel cup or that heel step. Therefore, a lot of soldiers are now annoyed with these PABs because they tend to slip off the heel. And then they also cause a rubbing sensation because if they slip, it then changes where the top part of the bracing rests, cutting into the foot, causing discomfort. The third concern associated with these is that they add about a 1 centimeter on either side. So it's quite difficult for a soldier who's trying to worry about landing that is now not used to that muscle memory of knees and ankles together, or knees and feet together, because they have that 2 centimeter gap in between. And that leads to some unsteadiness. So what I would like to do moving forward is I would like to reintroduce, or I would recommend the reintroduction of ankle bracing into the military for parachute operations. I like the idea of doing a study that would look at commercial ankle braces like the one pictured on the left. I didn't find any studies that related to military parachuters wearing commercial ankle braces as such. And to see, this would most likely be most effective done at Fort Benning in the airborne school, just due to the controlled environment, or more controlled than the field, implementing these commercial braces to see if they would in fact reduce ankle injuries within parachutists. And then the other thing is that we're wearing Nike boots. It's an athletic style boot. It's got the free run pattern on the bottom. Let's use this athletic training sense of treatment management by putting this ankle bracing underneath the boot, which would then allow the soldier to continue their operations as such. If they're landing into the area of a building to go do a raid or whatnot, they could still be able to perform such with a little bit limited mobility, however, not to the point where it compromises the mission. Whereas with the PABs, they might have to stop, take them off, put them in their pack. Ounces equal pounds, and now it's pounds on your back, and a backpack might not be the most efficient. So overall, I would recommend the use of ankle bracing within the military due to the current studies that have been shown, but I'd also like to look into further studies and performing some research whether or not commercial braces would be the most effective. Thank you.